My name is Julia, and I am 33 years old. At my mother's 62nd birthday dinner, my sister dropped a $500 receipt on my plate and whispered that I could not even afford to eat there. I stayed completely silent and let her enjoy her moment of cruelty. Minutes later, the executive chef walked out personally. He bypassed the billionaires in the dining room and bowed his head to me. Ms. Bennett is everything perfect tonight. My entire family stopped talking. My sister demanded to know why he called me that. I just smiled. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. For the past decade, I have built a life far away from the crushing expectations of my family. The ambient jazz music of the Obsidian Room flowed softly through the dim dining area. It is known as the most exclusive fine dining restaurant in Chicago. The air always smelled faintly of roasted garlic, brown butter, and expensive black truffles. We were seated in the corner VIP alcove. It was a beautiful semi-private space draped in deep green velvet and bathed in warm, soft lighting. The table was set with heavy crystal water glasses and perfectly polished silver utensils. Local celebrities and wealthy executives spoke in hushed tones. Impeccably dressed waiters moved silently through the crowded room, carrying plates of delicate culinary art. It was a place designed entirely to make people feel important and powerful. Vanessa, my 36-year-old sister, let out a sharp and condescending laugh that cut right through the smooth jazz playing in the background. She reached across the pristine white tablecloth and dramatically tossed a small black leather booklet toward me. Her perfectly manicured fingers pushed it forward until it landed with a soft thud right on top of my empty bread plate. I looked down at the table. Peeking out from the edge of the dark leather was the receipt for the initial appetizers and the first round of extremely expensive craft cocktails. The total printed at the bottom was exactly $540. I simply stared at the printed numbers, feeling a deeply familiar knot of anxiety forming in the pit of my stomach. "Here, Julia. You can cover the starters," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with absolute arrogance. She brushed a strand of perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. "It is the least you can do to earn your seat today. Gregory and I pulled strings for 6 months just to secure this reservation for Mom. You should be thanking us on your hands and knees that we even invited you to join us." She took a delicate sip of her champagne and looked at me with undisguised pity. "We all know your little baking hobby barely covers your rent each month in that tiny apartment. Do not worry yourself over it. We will not make you pay for the Wagyu beef later. We know you cannot afford it." Gregory, her 38-year-old husband, swirled his expensive bourbon and nodded in firm agreement. He was a newly promoted senior vice president at Apex Commercial Real Estate, and he made sure absolutely everyone knew it. He wore a custom-tailored suit and carried himself with the bloated confidence of a man who thought he owned the world. A massive gold watch gleamed on his wrist, reflecting the dim restaurant lighting. "I had to call in 3 major corporate favors just to get us this corner alcove, Julia," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. "They do not just let anyone walk off the street and eat at the Obsidian Room. This place caters to actual success." My mother, Patricia, instantly chimed in to back up her golden child. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone and glared at me across the table. "Do not give your sister that sullen look, Julia," Patricia scolded. Her voice was sharp and carried just enough volume to turn a few heads at the adjacent tables. "You always ruin the aesthetic at these nice places with your miserable attitude. You should be immensely grateful that we included you in my birthday celebration instead of sitting there pouting like an ungrateful child." Patricia took a long sip of her vintage wine before continuing her verbal assault. "Besides, you owe this family. You owe your father. Let us not forget how Richard had to dip into his hard-earned retirement funds to bail out your pathetic little food truck 10 years ago. If your father had not stepped in to clean up your massive financial mess, you would probably be living on the street right now. You have been a severe financial drain on this family for your entire adult life." My father Richard sat quietly next to her, perfectly content to let his wife and eldest daughter tear me down. He just swirled the ice in his glass, offering a faint nod to validate Patricia's rewritten version of family history. It was the same lie they had repeated for a decade. The actual truth of the matter was very different. I had never taken a single dime from my father. That money had actually gone to cover up Vanessa's massive credit card debt and her failed luxury boutique. My parents preferred this narrative because it protected their favorite daughter and kept me as the family failure. I had spent 10 long years biting my tongue and swallowing my pride just to keep the peace. I did not shout. I did not argue. I simply sat back against the plush velvet booth and stared at the receipt resting on my plate. My silence seemed to infuriate Vanessa even more. She had always thrived on conflict, and she fed on my emotional reactions. For my entire childhood, she had pushed my buttons until I finally reacted just so she could play the innocent victim in front of our parents. But tonight I gave her absolutely nothing to work with. The silence stretched at our table thick and heavy. "I am not paying for food I did not order, Vanessa," I said. My voice was perfectly calm and measured. "I drank tap water, and I have not touched a single appetizer on this table. You and Gregory ordered 3 expensive rounds of imported oysters, caviar, and vintage champagne without consulting anyone else. You spent the first 20 minutes of this dinner bragging loudly about Gregory getting a massive corporate bonus at his real estate firm. Therefore, this bill is completely yours to pay." I reached out and slid the black leather booklet back across the cold marble table toward her. Vanessa turned a mottled shade of red. She opened her mouth to scream at me, but Gregory leaned forward and placed a heavy hand on her arm. A cruel and deeply arrogant smirk spread slowly across his flushed face. He signaled aggressively toward a passing waiter, snapping his fingers loudly in the air to get his attention. "Do not worry about it, Vanessa," Gregory sneered, keeping his eyes locked firmly on mine. "I will go ahead and order Julia a plain side salad so she does not max out her credit limit trying to keep up with us today." Before Gregory could even raise his hand to snap his fingers at a passing waiter, the heavy mahogany double doors of the kitchen swung open with a soft but commanding thud. The sound was subtle, yet it easily cut through the low, sophisticated murmur of the dining room and the smooth jazz playing from the overhead speakers. Executive Chef David stepped out into the warm, ambient light of the main floor. He wore a pristine white chef coat with his name embroidered in elegant silver thread across the chest. The Obsidian Room was famously strict about its kitchen hierarchy, and Chef David was a man who practically lived behind the line. He rarely made appearances in the main dining area. When he did venture out, it was considered a major event by the staff and the patrons alike. It was usually to greet high-profile dignitaries visiting culinary critics or the most elite investors in the city. Tonight, however, his intense focus was directed entirely toward our dimly lit corner alcove. Gregory saw him approaching and immediately puffed out his chest, completely abandoning his cruel plan to flag down a waiter for my side salad. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and shot a knowing, triumphant look across the table at my father. Richard nodded back with a look of deep satisfaction, clearly assuming that Gregory had managed to pull strings far beyond just securing a table. Vanessa sat up straighter, smoothing her blonde hair and pasting on her most radiant practice society smile. She clearly anticipated a moment of profound flattery, a moment she could later brag about to her friends at the country club. They all assumed the Michelin-starred chef was coming to pay his respects to a newly minted vice president of Apex Commercial Real Estate. They were practically glowing with self-importance, eager to be recognized as the most vital people in the room. Chef David moved with the quiet, confident authority. He walked directly past tables filled with local celebrities, ignoring the subtle nods of recognition from prominent city politicians and billionaire tech founders. A famous news anchor at a center table actually half raised a hand to wave, but Chef David strode right past him without breaking his stride. His eyes were locked on our table. The tension in our alcove shifted from arrogant mockery to eager anticipation. Gregory cleared his throat, lifting his chin entirely ready to accept whatever lavish praise or complimentary tasting plates were about to be offered to him. He even shifted his weight, preparing to stand and shake the famous man's hand. But Chef David did not stop at Gregory's side of the table. He did not look at Vanessa. He completely ignored Patricia and Richard, who were sitting rigidly in their seats waiting for their due respect. Instead, Chef David walked straight past Gregory's outstretched hand, leaving the man frozen in an awkward, half-lifted posture. David rounded the large circular booth and came to a stop directly beside my chair. He did not offer a casual greeting. He bowed his head respectfully, a gesture of deep professional reverence that sent a visible shockwave across the faces of my family members. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice calm, deferential, and perfectly clear over the background music. "The seasonal tasting menu is prepped to your exact specifications. The white truffle imported from Alba arrived this morning just as you requested, and the kitchen staff is fully briefed on the progression of the courses. Is the lighting in the VIP alcove to your liking, or should I have the host dim the sconces for you?" The entire table froze in absolute disbelief. The lively clinking of heavy silver utensils against fine china abruptly stopped. My mother lowered her wine glass so quickly that a drop of red wine spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth, blooming like a tiny, violent stain. My father simply stared, his mouth slightly parted, his usual authoritative scowl replaced by a mask of sheer bewilderment. Gregory slowly lowered his unacknowledged hand back to his lap, his face turning a blotchy, embarrassed red. He looked around the alcove as if searching for a hidden camera, unable to process why a man of David's caliber would bypass a corporate vice president to defer to a woman he had just labeled a financial drain. I offered Chef David a warm, familiar smile. "The lighting is absolutely perfect, David," I replied, keeping my tone relaxed and professional. "Thank you for ensuring the truffles arrived on time. I know the logistics were complicated this week. You and the team have done a phenomenal job setting up for tonight. Please tell the sous chef that her adjustments to the dry-aged Wagyu prep are approved for the main floor service tomorrow. We will proceed with the tasting menu whenever the kitchen is ready." Chef David nodded graciously. "Right away, Ms. Bennett. I will personally oversee the plating for your table. Enjoy your evening." He gave another respectful bow and turned back toward the kitchen, walking away with the same commanding presence he had arrived with. He left a suffocating, heavy silence in his wake. For a long moment, nobody at the table dared to speak or even breathe. The contrast between their loud, vicious bragging just 3 minutes ago and this profound, quiet shock was staggering. They had spent the entire evening and the better part of a decade painting me as a pathetic, struggling baker who needed to be bailed out and pitied. They had dragged me here tonight specifically to use me as a prop, a poor relative they could mock to elevate their own sense of superiority. They had reveled in their cruelty, assuming I was powerless to defend myself against their combined wealth and status, and now the very fabric of their carefully constructed reality was unraveling right in front of their eyes. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. The forced, elegant smile she had prepared for the chef had completely vanished, replaced by a contorted expression of furious confusion. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the marble table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The illusion of her dominance had been shattered, and she was scrambling to comprehend the impossible scene she had just witnessed. "Why on earth did he just call you that?" Vanessa demanded, her voice cracking, breaking the refined quiet of the dining room. "Why is the executive chef of this restaurant talking to you about tasting menus and Wagyu preparation? You bake muffins in a tiny rented kitchen on the edge of the city. You cannot even afford to buy your own drinks here tonight. Why is he treating you like you are his boss?" Her voice had risen to a shrill pitch, drawing irritated glances from a nearby table of executives. Gregory shot her a warning look, deeply uncomfortable with the public scene she was creating, but he was clearly just as desperate for an answer. My mother looked like she might faint, her hand clutching her pearls as she stared at me as if I were a stranger who had just slipped into her daughter's skin. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The superiority they had wielded over me like a weapon had been neutralized in a matter of seconds, and they had absolutely no idea how to process the sudden shift in gravity. I did not rush to answer her. I let the panic simmer in the air between us, savoring the absolute quiet that had fallen over my relatives. I reached forward with slow, deliberate precision. I placed my fingertips on the small black leather booklet containing the $500 receipt for the oysters and cocktails. The receipt that Vanessa had so dramatically tossed onto my bread plate just moments ago. With a gentle, measured push, I slid the leather booklet back across the smooth marble surface. It glided effortlessly, coming to a dead stop right next to Vanessa's crystal champagne flute. I leaned back against the deep green velvet of the booth, meeting my sister's furious, panicked gaze with absolute calm. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile before delivering the truth that would change our family dynamic forever. He is asking because I own the restaurant, Vanessa. The words hung in the air, vibrating against the soft jazz and the low hum of the dining room. I watched the realization wash over my sister's face, a slow and agonizing process that drained the remaining color from her cheeks. For a brief, fleeting second, I actually thought someone might offer a word of congratulations. It was a foolish, naive hope, a remnant of the little girl who had spent her entire life desperately trying to earn a single nod of approval from these people. I had built a culinary empire from the ground up, turning a struggling food truck into the most sought-after reservation in the city. Any normal family would have been overjoyed. Any normal mother would have stood up and wrapped her arms around her daughter, shedding tears of pride. But we were not a normal family. As the shock finally wore off, the atmosphere in the VIP alcove did not soften with pride or joy. It hardened into something incredibly ugly and deeply familiar. My mother was the first to strike. Her face, previously frozen in bewilderment, suddenly twisted into a mask of furious indignation. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand down on the cold marble table, rattling the heavy crystal water glasses. "You own this restaurant," Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and absolute disbelief. "You own the Obsidian Room, and you sat there in silence while your sister spent the last 6 months agonizing over a reservation." I stared at her, genuinely taken aback by the sheer velocity of her pivot. She was not processing my success. She was instantly calculating how my success had inconvenienced her favorite child. "Do you have any idea what you have put Vanessa through?" Patricia continued, her volume rising steadily and drawing glances. She checked her email every single morning, hoping for a cancellation. She practically begged the concierges on the phone. Gregory had to call in favors with his corporate partners just to get us this table for my birthday. And you, her own flesh and blood, were the one pulling the strings the entire time. You let your own sister wait like a commoner on a waitlist for half a year just to spite her. The accusation was so profoundly ridiculous that I almost laughed. They had never once asked me about my career. They had spent a decade actively avoiding any conversation about my business, shutting me down whenever I tried to share a small victory. They assumed I was a failure because they needed me to be a failure. Now my mother was twisting my silent perseverance into a malicious plot designed exclusively to ruin Vanessa's social life. "It is incredibly selfish, Julia," Patricia snapped, leaning across the table and pointing a finger directly at my chest. "It is petty and vindictive to withhold something like this from your family. You should have given us VIP access the moment you opened the doors. We deserved better." Unbelievable. Before I could even begin to address the staggering entitlement pouring out of my mother, my father decided it was time to reassert his authority. Richard Bennett did not like being outsmarted, and he certainly did not like sitting at a table where he was not the most powerful person in the room. He slammed his heavy fist down on the table, creating a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the dining room. Several patrons at nearby tables turned to look, their conversations stalling as they watched the wealthy patriarch throw a tantrum. "I do not care who you think you are in this kitchen, Julia." Richard growled, his voice carrying the harsh, gravelly tone he reserved for insubordinate employees. "You do not disrespect your mother on her birthday, and you certainly do not play these manipulative little games with your sister. You have embarrassed this family enough for one lifetime." I kept my posture relaxed, refusing to shrink back into the velvet booth. "I am not playing games, Dad," I replied evenly. "I am simply dining at my own establishment." "And since you own the place," Richard sneered, cutting me off with a wave of his hand, You will instantly comp this entire meal, every single penny of it. You owe your mother a proper celebration. This dinner is going to cost over $4,000 tonight. You will tell that chef of yours to tear up the check out of respect. It is mandatory. Do it right now." I looked at the four angry faces glaring back at me. They felt so incredibly justified in their outrage. They had just spent an hour mocking my financial situation, humiliating me over a side salad, and demanding I pay for their expensive appetizers to earn my seat. Now learning I had the resources they coveted, they instantly demanded free luxury. The sheer hypocrisy was breathtaking. I slowly reached for my glass of sparkling water, taking a calm sip before responding. "I will not be comping this meal," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. The silence that followed was thick and electric. Gregory scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief, while Vanessa let out a dramatic gasp. I looked directly at my brother-in-law, letting my gaze lock onto his. "Gregory, you spent the first 20 minutes of this dinner bragging loudly about your massive corporate bonus. You detailed the exact percentage of your commission from your latest real estate acquisition. You made it abundantly clear to everyone in this alcove that you are a highly successful vice president. Since you are performing so incredibly well at your firm, a $4,000 dinner bill should be absolutely nothing to you. It is pocket change for a man of your caliber, is it not? You certainly did not seem worried about the cost when you ordered the most expensive champagne on my menu to celebrate your own success." Gregory's face turned a mottled, furious red. His jaw immediately tightened up. He struggled to find a single comeback that would not entirely undermine his previous arrogant bragging. He was thoroughly trapped by his own deeply inflated ego. To complain about the immense bill now would be to admit he could not actually afford the lavish lifestyle he was desperately trying to project to the world. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, ultimately glaring down at his empty plate in humiliated, defeated silence. My father angrily slammed his hand on the table again, preparing to unleash a fresh wave of verbal abuse, but Vanessa suddenly held up her hand to stop him. She could see that the dynamic was shifting dangerously out of her favor. Her husband had been silenced, her parents' demands had been flatly rejected, and I was sitting there completely unfazed by their collective anger. The narrative she had carefully controlled her entire life was rapidly unraveling right before her very eyes, and the spotlight was moving far away from her victimhood. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers curl into tight fists against the tablecloth. Her eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits as her chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths while she frantically searched for a way out. She was losing her grip on the situation, and she knew she needed to regain dominance immediately before I completely dismantled her illusion of superiority. Realizing she was losing control of the narrative, Vanessa panicked and quickly prepared to use our absolute favorite family weapon against me today. Vanessa leaned so far across the table that her diamond pendant dipped precariously close to her untouched plate of oysters. The deep flush of embarrassment that had covered her face only seconds ago rapidly morphed into a violent and mottled shade of crimson rage. Her eyes darted wildly around the luxurious alcove as she frantically sought a way to tear down the reality I had just presented to her. She could not accept that the sister she had mocked all evening was standing above her in the very hierarchy she worshipped. The heavy crystal glasses on the table rattled slightly as she slammed her open palms against the marble surface. She took a sharp and jagged breath. When she finally spoke, her voice completely lost its practiced and elegant country club modulation. It was a shrill and desperate screech that cut right through the sophisticated ambient hum of the busy restaurant. "You do not own anything, Julia," Vanessa screamed, pointing a violently trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You are sitting there acting like some brilliant and completely independent entrepreneur, but we all know exactly how you got the money to open this place. You did not build this restaurant with your own hard work. You bought it with stolen money. You are nothing but a massive and pathetic fraud." My mother gasped and pressed her hand against her chest, looking back and forth between us with exceptionally wide eyes. But she did not stop Vanessa. She never stopped Vanessa. My sister was finally pulling out the ultimate family lie, the one massive fabrication that had completely defined my entire adult life and driven a permanent wedge between me and my parents. It was a story so deeply ingrained in our family mythology that I genuinely believed Vanessa had fully convinced herself it was the absolute, unvarnished truth. 10 years ago, when I first announced I was attending culinary school, a massive sum of money went completely missing from my father's retirement accounts. It was exactly $75,000. Rather than conduct a real investigation, my family immediately pinned the heavy blame entirely on me. They told all our relatives that I had maliciously manipulated my father into signing over those specific funds to pay for my tuition. It was a very convenient and devastating lie that allowed the true culprit to simply walk away, completely spotless. And now Vanessa was purposefully weaponizing that exact same lie right here in the middle of my own dining room. You stole $75,000 from Dad's retirement fund 10 years ago. Vanessa yelled, her shrill voice bouncing off the deep velvet walls of the VIP alcove. You bled this entire family dry just to pay for your stupid culinary school and your useless little food truck. You took absolutely everything Dad worked for and you used it to fund your pathetic little culinary fantasies. You never paid back a single dime of that stolen money. You just packed up and confidently walked away while Mom and Dad suffered the consequences. And now you have the absolute arrogant nerve to sit here drinking sparkling water and acting like you are some incredibly self-made success story. You are a thief playing boss. The vicious venom in her voice was incredibly palpable. It was an absolute masterclass in familial gaslighting. I watched her chest heave rapidly with the extreme exertion of her own deeply self-righteous anger. She was staring fiercely at me with a look of pure and unadulterated hatred, completely convinced that she had just delivered the final and fatal emotional blow to my pride. She genuinely thought she had permanently unmasked me in front of her husband. Gregory instantly leaned forward, eagerly taking the cruel bait his wife had just thrown down. His initial blistering humiliation over the Wagyu beef and his own empty bragging vanished, completely replaced by a fresh wave of highly aggressive corporate posturing. He puffed out his chest again and smugly adjusted the expensive silk tie neatly knotted around his neck, looking at me with a deeply condescending scowl. He completely bought into Vanessa's fabricated narrative without a single solitary moment of hesitation or critical thought. "Is that so, Julia?" Gregory said, his deep voice thoroughly dripping with absolute disgust. He crossed his thick arms securely over his chest and shook his head slowly. "I always knew there was something horribly sketchy about your little business ventures. Real, legitimate entrepreneurs do not just suddenly acquire prime commercial real estate right here in the West Loop without a massive influx of hidden capital. You purposefully committed financial fraud against your own parents. You stole from a hardworking man just so you could play successful restaurant owner." Gregory leaned even closer to the table, lowering his voice into a menacing and explicitly threatening register. He was actively trying to intimidate me using the exact same ruthless bullying tactics he probably used daily in his commercial real estate boardroom. "You know the Chicago dining scene is incredibly small, Julia," Gregory sneered. "The elite investors, the top food critics, the city health inspectors, they all talk to each other. My real estate firm deals directly with restaurant commercial leases all over this entire city. I know exactly who to call tomorrow morning, and I know exactly what to say to them. If I expose your highly fraudulent business practices to the right influential people, this fancy little restaurant of yours will be completely empty by the end of the month. Nobody in their right mind wants to eat at an establishment owned and operated by a deceitful thief. I will personally make sure your reputation is completely destroyed within weeks. I will absolutely ruin you in this city." I shifted my gaze directly away from Gregory's red and visibly angry face and looked at my father. Richard sat comfortably back against the plush green velvet fabric of the restaurant booth. He was silently watching the ugly scene unfold with a profoundly smug and deeply enabling look plastered on his face. He had not spoken a single word to defend me. He had not intervened to stop Gregory from brazenly threatening my livelihood. He was perfectly content to simply sit back in silence and let Vanessa verbally tear me down piece by piece, just to stubbornly maintain the deeply toxic family hierarchy he had established so many years ago. It was a rigid hierarchy where he was the benevolent savior, and I was the constant, unending disappointment. My father casually picked up his heavy crystal glass and took a slow, highly measured sip of his expensive bourbon. He stared at me with remarkably cold and calculating eyes. He was waiting for me to shatter. He was eagerly waiting for the familiar tears to inevitably well up in my eyes. He was fully expecting me to lower my head to apologize profusely and to beg for their collective forgiveness. That was precisely how this game had always ended when I was a child. They would forcefully back me directly into a corner with their unified lies and their relentless shouting until I simply surrendered my entire reality just to keep the peace. They fully expected me to fold right now, right here in the middle of my own upscale restaurant. I did not flinch. Instead, I reached into my designer handbag, a bag Vanessa had loudly mocked as a cheap knockoff earlier, and pulled out a thick, notarized envelope. The crisp sound of tearing paper seemed magnified in the tense quiet of our dining alcove as I broke the thick wax seal on the back of the envelope. I did not rush the process. I let the heavy notarized flap fall open, taking my time to extract the pristine stack of documents nestled inside. They were bound by a sturdy metal clip, the top page bearing the unmistakable seal of a major national bank. The edges of the paper were perfectly sharp, completely untouched by the decade that had passed since they were printed. I held the stack for just a moment, feeling the undeniable weight of the truth resting in the palm of my hand. This was the exact ammunition I had kept safely locked away in a fireproof safe for 10 long years, waiting for the perfect moment. I leaned forward, moving deliberately, and dropped the heavy stack onto the table. I gave it a firm push, sending it sliding across the polished marble right over Vanessa's pristine white plate. It covered her expensive cutlery and rested mere inches from her tightly clenched fists. Vanessa flinched backward as if the stack of paper had physically burned her. She stared down at the documents, her previously flushed face suddenly draining of all its furious color. My mother stretched her neck trying to read the upside-down print, while my father shifted his weight, the ice clinking in his bourbon glass. He recognized the seal immediately. I could see the exact second the smug, enabling confidence completely evaporated from Richard Bennett's eyes, replaced instantly by cold, creeping dread. "Go ahead and look at the first page, Vanessa," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, yet it carried an undeniable edge that commanded complete attention. That is a certified, fully notarized bank ledger from exactly 10 years ago. It details every single transaction regarding the $75,000 you spent the last 10 minutes accusing me of stealing. I suggest you read the second line down. Vanessa refused to touch the paper. She just sat there breathing heavily, her eyes darting between me and the document. When she refused to cooperate, I simply reached over and flipped to the first page for her, tapping my index finger firmly against the highlighted row of numbers. "Since you are apparently struggling with reading comprehension tonight, I will happily break it down for you," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly clinical and detached. 10 years ago, on October 12th, our father withdrew exactly $75,000 from his primary retirement account. The family narrative has always boldly claimed that he was forced to write a check to my culinary school to bail me out of a massive hole. But if you look at the routing numbers right there on the third line, you will clearly see that not a single dime of that money ever touched my bank account. It certainly never went to any culinary institution either. My mother leaned closer, squinting at the dense rows of financial data. "What are you talking about, Julia?" Patricia demanded, her voice wavering with a sudden lack of certainty. "Your father told me he had to pay for your terrible mistakes." "He lied to you, Mom," I replied smoothly, never breaking eye contact with my sister. "And he has kept lying to you for a decade. Look at the destination routing number. That $75,000 was wired directly into a hidden shell account managed by a third-party financial entity. an entity that specifically specializes in quiet, highly confidential debt liquidation. "Julia, that is enough!" Richard suddenly barked. His voice was loud, but it lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded distinctly panicked, slightly reedy around the edges. He placed his hands flat on the table and made a sudden, desperate move to grab the ledger away from Vanessa. "This is private family business, and it does not belong at a dinner table. Put those papers away right now." I swiftly placed my hand firmly on top of the document, pinning it flat against the marble before his fingers could reach it. "We are at my table, Dad," I reminded him, my voice dropping to a dangerously low volume. "And you do not get to dictate the rules of engagement here. Not anymore. You were perfectly happy to sit back in silence and watch Vanessa falsely accuse me of severe financial fraud just 3 minutes ago. You were perfectly content to let Gregory threaten to destroy my restaurant based on a fabricated story you invented. So no, we are not going to put these papers away. We are going to finish the story." I turned my attention fully back to my sister. She was trembling visibly now. The aggressive, self-righteous posture she had maintained all evening had entirely collapsed. "That shell account did not hold the money for long," I explained, tapping the next page of the ledger. "Within 48 hours, the funds were dispersed to pay off 3 massive delinquent credit card balances that were completely maxed out and severely past due. The remaining $40,000 went directly to settle the outstanding commercial lease on a failed luxury boutique located in the Gold Coast." I let the words hang in the air, watching them strike Vanessa like physical blows. "You were 26 years old, Vanessa." I continued, stripping away the final layers of her perfect facade. "You wanted to play the successful fashion entrepreneur, so you opened that boutique without doing any actual market research. You spent a fortune on high-end inventory that nobody wanted to buy, and you funded your lavish personal lifestyle using those business credit lines to make it look like you were turning a profit. When the business inevitably went totally bankrupt within 8 months, you were drowning in severe financial ruin." My mother gasped again, this time pressing both hands over her mouth. She stared at Vanessa in absolute shock. "Dad could not handle the social embarrassment of his golden child failing so spectacularly," I said, looking at my father with disgust. "He could not let his country club friends know that his perfect, brilliant eldest daughter was a massive financial liability who bankrupted her own business. So he engineered a grand, sweeping cover-up. He liquidated his own retirement funds to quietly bail you out, paid off all your secret debts, and then he pointed the finger directly at me. He used my culinary school tuition as a highly convenient smokescreen. He completely ruined my reputation in this family just to protect your fake pristine image." Vanessa opened her mouth to deny the accusations, to spin another convenient web of lies, but no sound emerged. She simply stared down at the damning evidence proving her complete financial incompetence. Gregory had been sitting rigidly beside her, listening to the surgical breakdown of his wife's deeply hidden past. He had spent his entire marriage believing he had secured a partner of equal status and immaculate financial standing. Slowly, he reached out and snatched the thick bank ledger right off the marble table, pulling it out from under my hand. His eyes scanned the certified documents, tracking the undeniable flow of the wire transfers and the massive credit card payoffs. His face drained of all color as his eyes widened in sheer horror. He was finally realizing that his absolutely perfect wife had a dark history of severe hidden financial ruin. Gregory stared at the crisp pages, trying to burn holes straight through the paper. The silence in the alcove was deafening. It was a suffocating quiet hanging over our meal. Patricia broke it. She could not handle the physical proof sitting in front of her. Her worldview, built on the foundation of my supposed failures and Vanessa's perfection, was rapidly collapsing. She reached out with a trembling hand and slapped the marble tabletop. "This is a fabrication," Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with desperate energy. She pointed a finger at the ledger clutched in Gregory's rigid hands. "You printed these out to humiliate us. You forged banking documents just to ruin my birthday dinner. How could you be so vicious, Julia? You have always been jealous of your sister, but this is a new low." Patricia vibrated with denial. She looked around the alcove, silently pleading with the rest of the table to agree with her unhinged theory. She grabbed her napkin and twisted it fiercely. "You are a bitter woman," Patricia continued, drawing curious stares from the main dining room floor. You manufactured fake wire transfers because you cannot stand the fact that Vanessa has a beautiful life and a successful husband. You want to drag her down to your miserable level. I did not bother to defend the documents. The bank seal and heavy notary stamp spoke for themselves. I kept my gaze locked on my father. Richard Bennett, the man who had demanded I comp a $4,000 meal moments ago, was undergoing a spectacular physical transformation. All the color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale shade of gray. His shoulders slumped forward in undeniable defeat. The commanding patriarch of the family looked small, fragile, and utterly cornered. Gregory peeled his eyes away from the damning records and turned to look directly at my father. The look on his face was a terrifying mixture of humiliation and boiling rage. Gregory prided himself on control, and he had just realized his father-in-law had played him for a fool. "Is this true, Richard?" Gregory demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "Did you wire $75,000 to cover up your daughter's secret bankruptcies before I married her? Did you purposefully hide massive corporate debt from me?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The man who had spent his life dominating boardrooms and intimidating his children was incapable of forming a single coherent sentence. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at the ledger, glanced at Vanessa, and finally looked down at his half-empty glass of bourbon. His silence was the loudest confession anyone could have ever given. He had spent a decade letting me take the blame for his financial cover-up. Now the absolute truth was staring him right in the face. Vanessa let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The polished, elegant society wife persona she had worn into the restaurant had entirely melted away. She suddenly realized she was no longer dealing with a compliant younger sister she could easily bully. She was dealing with a furious husband who had just discovered his entire marriage was built on a foundation of massive financial deception. Her chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths. She was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured hands clutching the edge of the marble table so tightly that her knuckles turned a stark bone white. "Gregory, please." Vanessa gasped, her voice shrill and pleading. She reached out to place a placating hand on his arm, but he violently jerked away from her touch. "You have to listen to me," she begged, her eyes brimming with panicked tears. "It was a long time ago. I was young, and I made some terrible business decisions. The boutique was failing and the credit card interest rates were completely out of control. I did not want to disappoint anyone. Dad just wanted to help me fix it before we started seriously dating. We were going to tell you eventually." Gregory let out a harsh, barking laugh that completely lacked any trace of humor. "You were going to tell me eventually." He repeated, his tone dripping with absolute revulsion. "We have been married for 5 years, Vanessa. You have spent the last 5 years mocking Julia for being a struggling baker while you were sitting on $75,000 of secretly bailed-out debt. You let me sit here tonight and threaten to expose her for financial fraud, knowing full well that you were the only actual fraud at this table. You lied to me about your finances, and your father actively helped you hide it." Vanessa sobbed openly now, the sound loud and pathetic in the quiet alcove. She pressed her hands against her face, her shoulders shaking with the sheer force of her public humiliation. The absolute social destruction she had always feared was happening right now. She was completely exposed, stripped of her fake accomplishments, and revealed as a negligent, financially illiterate failure who had to be rescued by her daddy. Gregory sat in silence for a long, heavy moment. He looked at his sobbing wife, his cowardly father-in-law, and his frantically denying mother-in-law. He was surrounded by a family of pathetic liars, and he was publicly humiliated by marrying into them. But more importantly, he had been humiliated by me. I was the one who had brought the damning documents to the table. I was the one who had calmly and surgically dismantled his entire evening. I was the one who owned the Michelin-starred restaurant, while he was left sitting at my table, holding the proof of his wife's absolute ruin. His immense ego simply could not tolerate the current power dynamic. As a highly successful corporate executive, he was losing a battle of dominance to a woman he had spent the last hour treating like garbage. He needed to reassert his control, not just over his shattered, weeping wife, but over the very room we were sitting in. He needed to remind everyone at the table exactly how much power he wielded in this city. Gregory suddenly threw the heavy bank ledger down onto the table with a violent flick of his wrist. The thick stack of certified documents slapped against the marble, sliding directly into Vanessa's plate of untouched oysters and knocking over her crystal champagne flute. The expensive liquid spilled rapidly across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric and dripping steadily onto the floor. Gregory ignored the mess completely. He placed both of his large hands flat on the edge of the table and forcefully pushed his chair back. He slowly stood up to his own full towering height. His broad shoulders squared as he loomed over the table, his physical presence designed to be as intimidating as possible. He glared down directly at me, his dark eyes burning with a very cold, highly calculated fury. He was no longer the embarrassed husband dealing with family drama. He was the ruthless corporate shark preparing to utterly destroy a rival business owner. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his silk collar as he leaned his heavy frame forward, invading my personal space. He took a slow, deep breath, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. "You think you're untouchable because of one restaurant? I'm a VP at Apex Commercial Real Estate. We're buying this entire city block next week. Consider your lease terminated." Gregory leaned closer, planting his hands heavily on the marble table. He was breathing hard, his chest expanding beneath his tailored suit as he prepared to deliver what he believed was a fatal blow to my livelihood. The brief vulnerability he had shown regarding Vanessa's financial ruin was gone, completely swallowed up by his need to assert absolute dominance over me. He looked around the dimly lit, elegant alcove of my restaurant with a sneer of pure disgust, evaluating the velvet booths and crystal chandeliers as if they were already nothing but a pile of worthless rubble. Apex Commercial Real Estate has been eyeing this particular neighborhood for the better part of 3 years. Gregory began, his voice dripping with venom and corporate superiority. "You honestly think you are so incredibly smart, playing the successful independent business owner? You think this one Michelin-starred dining room makes you a titan of industry? It is actually quite pathetic, Julia. You are nothing but a tiny ant standing directly in the path of a massive bulldozer. My firm does not care about your seasonal tasting menus or imported white truffles. We care about maximum square footage and premium corporate leasing. Our master plan for this street has been fully approved by the City Zoning Commission. We are going straight down this entire avenue, and we are going to bulldoze every single one of these quaint little independent local restaurants. We are going to rip this block down to the bare dirt and install a massive complex of high-rise corporate chain establishments. We are going to replace your useless vanity project with businesses that actually generate real revenue for real investors." He paused to let his threat hang in the air, a cruel smile stretching across his face. He stood up completely straight, buttoning his suit jacket with an arrogant flick of his wrists. "And the best part about all of this," Gregory continued, his voice echoing over the quiet jazz music, "is that there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop us. We have completely bypassed the individual leaseholders. Apex Commercial is currently finalizing the massive purchase of this entire commercial block directly from the actual property owners. We are dealing with an anonymous holding company called Vanguard Holdings. They own the deed to the physical building you are standing in right now, and they have already agreed to the preliminary terms of our massive buyout. The final contracts are being drawn up by our legal team as we speak. The ink will be dry by next week. The moment Vanguard Holdings signs over the deed to my firm, you are completely finished in this city. I will personally oversee the termination of your commercial lease. I am telling you right now, Julia, you have exactly 30 days to pack up your kitchen and get out of my building." His aggressive outburst acted like a sudden surge of electricity for my parents. Just moments ago, they had been sitting in paralyzed, humiliated silence as the irrefutable proof of their decade-long cover-up was laid bare on the table. But now, seeing Gregory tower over me, with the promise of my total financial ruin, their confidence came roaring right back. The power dynamic in the alcove shifted yet again. My father Richard suddenly sat up perfectly straight. The ashen gray color that had drained from his face when I produced the notarized banking documents was immediately replaced by an ugly, vibrant shade of red. His authoritative facade, which had crumbled so spectacularly just 5 minutes prior, was instantly and forcefully reconstructed. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his collar, looking at me with a deeply condescending and triumphant scowl. He was perfectly happy to ignore his massive financial lies, as long as his rebellious daughter was finally being put back in her proper place at the very bottom of the family hierarchy. Patricia also fed off this aggressive energy. She stopped wringing her napkin and wiped away her fake tears, looking at me with a familiar, chilling expression of absolute disgust. She was thrilled to see me being verbally attacked and threatened. She wanted to see my restaurant destroyed because my success was an active insult to her deeply held belief that I was nothing more than a pathetic disappointment. "You bring this completely on yourself, Julia," Richard declared, pointing a thick, accusatory finger across the marble table. "This is exactly what happens when you blatantly disrespect your own family. You thought you could sit here and throw forged banking documents in our faces to make us look bad. You thought you could humiliate your sister and your mother on her birthday. Now look at you. You are about to lose everything you have worked for because you do not know how to show proper respect." Richard took a slow, arrogant sip of his bourbon, swirling the ice in his glass. "You should have known better than to challenge a man like Gregory," he continued, his tone dripping with patriarchal authority. "He operates on a level of business that you simply cannot comprehend. You have made a terrible enemy today, and you are going to pay a heavy price. However, since we are still your family, I am willing to help you navigate this disaster if you are willing to follow my instructions exactly." I remained perfectly still, waiting to hear the inevitable demands. My father leaned forward, lowering his voice into a stern, commanding lecture. He honestly believed he was offering me a lifeline, completely blind to his own breathtaking hypocrisy. "You will start by apologizing immediately," Richard demanded, his eyes narrowing. "You will look at your sister and your brother-in-law and apologize profusely for making up these ridiculous stories about her boutique and my retirement funds. Then you will apologize to your mother for ruining her birthday dinner. After you have done that, you will walk into your kitchen and tell your staff to completely comp this entire meal. We will not be paying a dime tonight. Furthermore, to prove that you are genuinely sorry, you will provide free, fully staffed catering for all of your mother's upcoming charity events at her country club for the rest of the season." Richard leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach with a deeply satisfied sigh. He looked at Gregory for confirmation, seeking approval from the man who was supposedly about to bulldoze my entire life. "Do that and Gregory might show you mercy," Richard concluded, his voice echoing in the quiet dining space. "He might be willing to renegotiate the terms of your commercial lease when Apex takes over the building next week. He might let you keep your little kitchen if you learn your proper place in this family. But if you refuse, you will be out on the street in 30 days with nothing. The choice is entirely yours, Julia." The alcove fell dead silent once again. My mother nodded along with my father's demands, a wicked smile playing on her lips. Vanessa sat back, her confidence returning, as she looked at me with pure spite. Gregory remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for me to break down and beg for his corporate benevolence. They had completely cornered me, or at least they firmly believed they had. They were absolutely certain that the sheer weight of their combined threats would force me to submit to their will. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, allowing them to bask in their false victory. Then I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my private email app. The glow of the screen cast a cool light across my fingers as I tapped the glass. Gregory remained frozen in his aggressive stance, his heavy hands still planted firmly on the marble, his chest puffed out in a ridiculous display of manufactured corporate dominance. I took my time, deliberately letting the tension thicken the air around us. I scrolled past a few unread messages and opened the specific thread I had been waiting for all evening. I held the device up, rotating my wrist so the screen faced him directly. The brightness illuminated his furious, reddened face, highlighting the harsh lines around his mouth and the absolute certainty in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he had crushed me into the dust. I looked up at him, meeting his glare with a completely serene expression. My voice was dangerously calm when I finally broke the heavy silence. "I am just a little bit curious, Gregory," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and conversational. "I am wondering how exactly Apex Commercial Real Estate plans to terminate my lease, considering your massive, highly anticipated acquisition offer was formally rejected exactly 20 minutes ago." Gregory let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He rolled his eyes, throwing his head back in a dramatic show of exasperation. The arrogance radiating from him was almost a tangible force in the small dining alcove. "You are making a complete fool of yourself, Julia," he sneered, refusing to even lower his gaze to look at the phone in my hand. This is exactly the kind of pathetic, desperate behavior I would expect from someone who knows they are completely beaten. You cannot bluff your way out of a multi-million-dollar corporate real estate buyout by waving your cell phone around. You have absolutely no idea how the real business world operates. My firm has been negotiating this deal for months. The contracts are completely finalized. We are buying this building, and you are getting evicted. My father chimed in right on cue, eager to support the man he believed held the keys to his family's continued social standing. "Put the phone away, Julia," Richard commanded, his voice returning to its usual booming volume. "Stop playing these ridiculous games. You are only making the situation worse for yourself. Gregory is offering you a chance to save your miserable little career, and you are throwing it back in his face with childish lies. Apologize to him right now before he decides to completely destroy your reputation in this city." I completely ignored my father. I did not even spare him a passing glance. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Gregory, my arm perfectly steady as I held the phone up in front of his face. I did not say another word. I simply waited. Gregory sneered at me one last time, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He finally dropped his gaze to the glowing screen, fully intending to mock whatever fake email or desperate text message I was trying to show him. I watched his dark eyes lock onto the top of the screen. I watched him recognize the official letterhead of his own company. I watched him see the highly confidential deal reference numbers that were supposed to be locked away in the most secure files of Apex Commercial Real Estate. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The smug, condescending sneer vanished from Gregory's face, as if it had been physically slapped off of him. His eyes widened to an almost comical degree, darting frantically back and forth across the illuminated text. The color drained from his cheeks in a sudden rush, leaving his skin a sickly pale yellow. His heavy hands, which had been pressing so forcefully into the marble table, began to tremble uncontrollably. The sturdy foundation of his corporate arrogance simply evaporated into thin air, replaced entirely by sheer unadulterated terror. He blinked rapidly, opening and closing his mouth like a fish suffocating on dry land. He leaned closer to the screen, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged as he read the words over and over again, desperately hoping his eyes were deceiving him. But the text was clear, undeniable, and utterly devastating. It was a formal, legally binding rejection letter. It outlined the exact terms of the offer Apex Commercial had submitted for the entire city block, referenced the specific parcels of land, and explicitly stated that the anonymous seller was permanently terminating all negotiations effective immediately. My mother leaned to the side, trying to peer around Gregory's massive frame to see what was on the screen. "Gregory, what is it?" Patricia asked, her voice faltering as she noticed the absolute panic radiating from her son-in-law. "What does it say? Tell her she is lying." Gregory did not answer her. He could not answer her. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare where his entire career was crumbling before his eyes. The deal he had just bragged about, the massive corporate acquisition he had used to threaten my livelihood, was completely dead. He had just staked his entire reputation on a buyout that no longer existed. I slowly lowered the phone, placing it gently face up on the marble table, right next to the bank ledger that proved his wife's financial ruin. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and looked up at the terrified man standing before me. As you can see, I said, my voice cutting through the silent panic gripping the alcove. Vanguard Holdings is no longer interested in doing business with Apex Commercial. The seller found your firm's development plans to be remarkably short-sighted and incredibly detrimental to the local community. They have absolutely no intention of letting you bulldoze a thriving culinary district just so you can install a row of soulless corporate chain restaurants. Your master plan is completely dead in the water, Gregory. You are not buying this building. You are not terminating my lease. You are not going to do a single thing you just threatened to do. Vanessa grabbed Gregory's sleeve, shaking his arm in a frantic bid for his attention. Gregory, please say something, she cried, her voice climbing in pitch. Tell her she is making this up. Tell them you are still buying the building. We cannot let her win like this. You have to put her in her place. Gregory slowly turned his head to look down at his wife. He looked at her as if she were a complete stranger, a dangerous liability he had unknowingly chained himself to. He slowly pulled his arm out of her grasp, stepping back from the table as if the marble itself were suddenly scorching hot. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, his mind clearly struggling to comprehend the massive shift in reality that had just occurred. He was a man who lived and breathed corporate intelligence. He knew exactly how tight the security protocols were surrounding this specific acquisition. He knew that the identity of the seller behind Vanguard Holdings was a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few executives at the very top of his firm. He knew that the rejection letter displayed on my phone had been sent exclusively to the absolute highest level of his company. The pieces were slowly clicking together in his panicked mind. He was looking at a local chef, an independent business owner his family had spent the entire evening treating like absolute garbage, and he was realizing that I held the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. He realized that the quiet, supposedly struggling sister had completely outmaneuvered him on a corporate battlefield he thought he owned. He took another step back, his legs bumping against the chair he had pushed away just minutes ago. The threatening, looming posture he had used to intimidate me was completely gone. He looked completely broken, stripped of all his power and influence. His eyes were wide with shock as he stared down at the phone resting innocently on the table. He opened his mouth, his voice coming out as a weak, trembling whisper that carried none of its former authority. How do you have this email? Only the CEO of Vanguard Holdings was copied on this. I watched the sheer terror vibrating through his massive physical frame. He was clutching the edge of the marble table again, but this time it was purely to keep his trembling legs from giving out. I let a slow, perfectly composed smile spread across my face as I answered his desperate question. Because Vanguard Holdings is not a group of anonymous corporate investors, Gregory I replied, my voice crystal clear and cutting straight through the quiet jazz music playing in the dining space. Vanguard Holdings is a single-member limited liability company that I personally registered in the state of Delaware exactly 7 years ago. I am the sole owner. I am the sole managing director. I am the chief executive officer. I did not just receive a blind copy of that rejection letter on some random email thread. I wrote the letter myself. I signed it with my own hand, and I personally instructed my corporate legal team to send it directly to your boss exactly 20 minutes ago. The oxygen was instantly sucked out of the alcove. My mother let out a strangled, high-pitched sound, pressing both of her hands hard against her chest, as if her heart had suddenly stopped beating. My father fell back against the plush velvet upholstery of the booth, his jaw going completely slack. He stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes, struggling to reconcile the wealthy real estate magnate sitting across from him with the pathetic failure of a daughter he had spent the entire evening berating. You own this building. Richard breathed, his voice barely a raspy whisper. He looked around the elegant restaurant, staring at the expensive fixtures and the immaculate architectural details, finally seeing them not as a rented vanity project, but as a crown jewel in a massive commercial portfolio. I own the entire block, Dad. I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the exact way he visibly flinched at the staggering scale of my assets. And I own 3 other commercial blocks just like it in the downtown corridor. You see, while you were all busy congratulating yourselves on the fake boutique and mocking my culinary ambitions, I was actually working. I started out with that battered secondhand food truck that you all found so incredibly embarrassing. You remember the one, right? The rusty metal truck you absolutely refused to let me park in your pristine suburban driveway because it might upset your wealthy neighbors. I worked grueling 18-hour shifts in that cramped, sweltering box. I poured every single penny of profit right back into my business account. I lived in a tiny, rundown studio apartment, and I saved my money while Vanessa was busy maxing out secret credit lines to fund her luxurious lifestyle. I kept my gaze fixed intently on my parents, making sure they heard every single word of the truth they had willfully ignored for over a decade. When the commercial real estate market took a massive dive 5 years ago, I did not panic. I took all of that hard-earned capital, and I bought my first dilapidated commercial property at rock-bottom prices. I renovated it, leased it out to a reliable corporate tenant, and used that steady revenue stream to leverage my next big purchase. I built Vanguard Holdings piece by piece, property by property, completely under the radar. I intentionally hid behind anonymous corporate structures because I knew exactly what you would do if you found out I had money. You would have demanded I use my wealth to bail out her endless string of failures, just like you did with your own retirement fund. I protected my empire from this family while you all spent years telling your country club friends that I was a struggling, misguided dropout who was going nowhere in life. Gregory was no longer listening to the family history. His breathing had escalated into a rapid, shallow wheeze that sounded painfully loud in the confined space. He stumbled backward, his heavy legs hitting the wall of the alcove. He pressed his broad back against the expensive wallpaper, clutching at his chest as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The aggressive, domineering corporate shark was completely gone, replaced by a hyperventilating broken man facing total professional ruin. The promotion! Gregory gasped, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an emergency exit that did not exist. He ripped his silk tie loose, popping the top button of his expensive dress shirt in a desperate bid for oxygen. The vice president position. It was entirely contingent on securing this specific commercial block. Vanessa turned to look at her husband, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. "What are you talking about, Gregory?" she asked, her voice shaking with fresh panic. "You already got the promotion. You told me the position was yours. You told my father it was a done deal." "It was a conditional offer," Vanessa. Gregory shouted, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria. He swiped a trembling hand across his sweating forehead. "The senior partners at Apex gave me an ultimatum 3 months ago. They assigned me the Vanguard acquisition as a final test of my executive leadership. They told me that if I closed the deal, the vice president title and the massive salary increase were permanently mine. If I failed to secure this specific city block, they were not just going to pass me over for the promotion. They were going to let me go entirely. I have been bluffing my way through the office for weeks, telling everyone the Vanguard deal was an absolute certainty." He slid slowly down the wall, his expensive trousers gathering dust from the floorboards as he crouched into a pathetic, defeated ball. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with terror. "When the senior partners see that rejection letter on Monday morning, I am completely finished," he sobbed, the sound muffled by his palms. "They are going to fire me on the spot. I am going to lose my job, my stock options, my entire career. I have absolutely nothing." Vanessa stood frozen, processing the devastating confession tumbling from the lips of her husband. The reality of her situation was crashing down in crushing, undeniable waves. Her father had liquidated his retirement to save her from her own secret bankruptcy 10 years ago, leaving him with no more financial reserves to bail her out a second time. Her husband, the wealthy corporate executive she relied on to fund her lavish country club lifestyle, was going to be unemployed and disgraced by Monday morning. The luxurious house, the expensive cars, the designer clothes, and the exclusive social standing she cherished above all else were evaporating right before her eyes. The safety net she had depended on her entire life was completely gone, shredded into pieces by the very sister she had spent the evening mocking. She looked at me sitting calmly in my beautiful restaurant holding the immense wealth and power she desperately craved. The shock and humiliation on her face rapidly hardened into something incredibly dark and dangerous. The tears stopped flowing, replaced by a cold, unhinged fury. She clenched her fists at her sides, her manicured nails digging deep into her palms. She stepped toward the table, her eyes burning with pure, concentrated hatred. She was ready to tear my world apart, desperately seeking a target to blame for her own spectacular, self-inflicted downfall. For several seconds, nobody moved. The only sound at our table was Gregory's uneven breathing and the soft drip of spilled champagne sliding off the edge of the marble table onto the polished floor below. The restaurant around us had gone strangely quiet. Conversations at nearby tables had faded into cautious murmurs. Even the waitstaff seemed to move more slowly, sensing that something violent and irreversible had just happened without a single plate being thrown. Gregory looked smaller now. Not physically, because he was still a broad, well-dressed man in an expensive suit, but something essential had collapsed inside him. His entire personality had been built around access power and intimidation. He was the man who knew the right people, controlled the right rooms, and could destroy anyone beneath him with a few phone calls. But now he was standing in the middle of my restaurant, realizing that every threat he had made had traveled in the wrong direction. He had not been speaking down to me. He had been begging for mercy without knowing it. Vanessa stared at him as though she were watching a stranger fall apart. The beautiful, polished husband she had paraded in front of my parents like a luxury possession was suddenly nothing more than a terrified employee with a conditional title and a dying career. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I could see her calculating, trying to decide whether to comfort him, blame him, or abandon him before his failure could stain her. My mother recovered first, though recovery was the wrong word. Patricia simply reached for the nearest lie the way she always did when reality became too inconvenient. She turned to me with trembling rage in her eyes. "You planned this," she whispered. I looked at her calmly. "No, Mom. I protected myself." That simple sentence seemed to strike her harder than any insult could have. She had no answer for it because deep down she knew it was true. They had taught me exactly who they were. They had trained me to hide every good thing in my life because every victory would either be dismissed stolen or turned into another obligation. I had not become secretive because I was cruel. I had become secretive because being honest with them had never been safe. Richard's face darkened as he gripped the edge of the table. For the first time that evening, his anger did not look powerful. It looked desperate. He stared at the phone, then at the bank ledger, then at Gregory, searching for a version of the night where he still had control. But there was none. The papers exposed his lie. The email destroyed Gregory's threat. The restaurant exposed their ignorance. Every weapon they had brought to that table had been turned back on them. "You had no right to embarrass this family publicly," Richard growled. I leaned forward slightly. "You embarrassed yourselves. I only stopped pretending not to notice." That silenced him completely. Chef David appeared near the entrance of the alcove, not intruding, simply standing close enough to make it clear that I was not alone. Behind him, two senior managers waited with quiet professionalism. They did not need instructions. They had seen enough. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took one slow sip. "This dinner will continue," I said evenly. "But not with all of you at this table. Gregory threatened my business in my own dining room. Vanessa falsely accused me of theft in front of my staff and guests. Dad tried to extort free service from me, and Mom turned my success into another reason to punish me. I am done rewarding cruelty with silence." Vanessa's head snapped toward me. The shock on her face twisted instantly into hatred. Her world had not merely cracked, it had inverted. The poor sister was rich. The foolish baker owned the building. The golden daughter was a liability. And now, for the first time in her life, No one was rushing to protect her from the consequences. Her eyes narrowed, her hands curled into fists. The tears vanished from her face as if they had never been there. Then she finally found the target she wanted. Vanessa screamed, her voice shattering the quiet ambiance of the restaurant. "You did this on purpose!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You knew exactly what this deal meant for Gregory. You knew what it meant for me. You sabotaged his entire career just because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of my life, my marriage, and my success. You could not stand seeing me happy, so you orchestrated this entire twisted game just to destroy my husband." I kept my posture perfectly relaxed. I looked at her flushed face and narrowed my eyes. I rejected a terrible financial offer from a firm that is dangerously over-leveraged. I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. Their proposed development model was fundamentally flawed and their long-term projections were a complete joke. "It is just business, Vanessa. You would understand how these things work if you had not completely failed out of your own vanity boutique within 6 months of opening the doors." Vanessa gasped, her mouth falling open as she took a staggering step backward. The cruel reality of her own business failure hung heavily in the air, instantly silencing her hysterical accusations. She looked absolutely devastated, completely unable to formulate a coherent response as the truth finally pierced through her carefully constructed delusions. My father suddenly shifted his weight, his entire demeanor transforming in the blink of an eye. The aggressive, condescending patriarch vanished. He held up his hands in a placating gesture, forcing a warm, paternal smile that looked incredibly unnatural on his face. "Now hold on a minute," he said, his voice dropping to a smooth, reasonable tone. "Let us not say things we cannot take back. We are a family, and family members occasionally have misunderstandings." He moved closer to the table, looking at me with manufactured pride. "Julia, sweetheart, I have to admit I am incredibly impressed. You played this very close to the chest. Building an entire real estate holding company right under our noses is a remarkable achievement. You have truly proven yourself as a brilliant businesswoman. I am so deeply proud of the woman you have become." I stared at him, feeling a sudden intense wave of genuine nausea at his incredibly transparent self-serving manipulation. He was desperately trying to pivot, frantically trying to salvage his own precarious financial stability by appealing directly to a father-daughter bond that had never truly existed between us. "But we absolutely have to look at the bigger picture here," Richard continued, his voice taking on a frantic pleading quality. "My manufacturing company relies heavily on the corporate credit lines facilitated by Apex Commercial. If Gregory goes down and Apex pulls their backing, my business is going to face a catastrophic liquidity crisis. We could lose absolutely everything we have built. I need you to call their executive team right now. Tell them you reconsidered the offer. Tell them you will accept the buyout. You have to do this to save the family's future. We must always stick together, Julia." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, empty pity. "I am not calling anyone tonight," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering finality. "I am not accepting a terrible real estate deal to bail out a corporate middleman who blindly insulted me in my own building. And I am certainly not risking my massive portfolio to save a manufacturing company that you mismanaged into the ground." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool marble table. "You want to talk about families sticking together," I said, locking my gaze onto his wide, desperate eyes. "Let us talk about why you actually brought me here tonight. You did not invite me to this restaurant to celebrate Mom. You did not invite me because you genuinely wanted to spend quality time with your youngest daughter. You invited me so Vanessa would have a captive audience for her fake wealth. You needed someone at the table who you deemed inferior, so you could all pat yourselves on the back and feel superior by comparison. You needed your designated scapegoat." I let my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of my parents and my sister. "But the scapegoat owns the pasture now." I turned my attention fully to my father, refusing to let him look away. "You sit there trying to play the proud, loving father, acting as if you supported my business acumen all along. But you never saw my potential. You only saw me as a financial liability, an embarrassment that you tried to hide from your country club friends. Your paternal pride is a complete illusion activated only when you realized my bank account could save you from your own reckless financial decisions. You want me to sacrifice my livelihood just to protect the crumbling facade of your manufacturing empire, but you never once offered to protect me when I needed it. Then I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was still clutching her chest, looking around the beautifully designed restaurant as if she had suddenly woken up on another planet. "And you, Mom," I said, watching her shrink back against the velvet cushions. "You spent the entire evening judging the decor, the menu, and the ambiance, completely obsessed with the shallow aesthetics of wealth. You judged my clothes, my career, and my lifestyle, convinced that I was a tragic failure because I did not marry a man in a suit or carry a designer handbag. You value the appearance of success so much that you completely blinded yourself to the reality of what genuine hard work actually looks like. You thought building an empire meant dining in expensive restaurants. But true wealth is built by the people standing in the hot kitchens working tirelessly while you sip your champagne." I raised my hand slightly, catching the attention of the head waiter, who had been hovering discreetly near the entrance of the alcove throughout the entire confrontation. He immediately stepped forward, his posture impeccably professional. He was carrying a sleek black leather folder, which he placed gently on the table before stepping away without uttering a single word. I reached out and opened the folder, glancing down at the long, itemized receipt. The extensive printed list detailed every single exorbitant extravagance they had recklessly charged to the tab. It displayed the 3 crystal bottles of vintage champagne, the imported Wagyu beef, the freshly shaved truffles, the artisanal caviar, and the towering tiered seafood platters my family had so eagerly ordered when they foolishly assumed they were celebrating Gregory's massive corporate victory over my seemingly pathetic life. I carefully closed the thick leather folder and picked it up with a smooth, fluid motion. I extended my arm across the table and dropped the full $4,500 check directly in front of Gregory and Vanessa. The heavy thud of the leather hitting the cool marble echoed loudly in the silent alcove, perfectly punctuating the absolute devastation of their entire evening. I looked at my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law. They foolishly expected me to fold, conditioned by decades of compliance. Instead, I slowly raised my hand. "I'll comp Mom's slice of birthday cake," I said. "The rest is on you. If your card declines, I'll have security escort you to the dish pit." My mother resorted to the only defense mechanism she had left. Patricia burst into hysterical tears. It was not a quiet weeping. It was a loud wail designed to immediately paint herself as the ultimate victim in a tragedy she had entirely orchestrated. She pressed both hands to her face, her shoulders heaving as she let out a piercing sob that echoed through the acoustic perfection of the dining room. "You have completely ruined my birthday!" she cried out, her voice vibrating with manufactured anguish. She pointed a trembling finger at me, making sure the nearby tables could hear every single word of her performance. "You planned this entire vicious spectacle just to humiliate me on my special day. You are a deeply cruel, unnatural daughter. I gave you life, I raised you in a beautiful home, and this is how you repay your own mother. You are purposely destroying our family in front of all these people. I just wanted a nice dinner, and you turned it into a nightmare." Her wailing grew louder, an embarrassing high-pitched keen that caused the surrounding patrons to lower their forks and turn their heads in our direction. For decades, that exact tone of voice had been my absolute undoing. It was the sound that signaled I was about to be punished or subjected to weeks of silent treatment until I begged for forgiveness. But standing there now, listening to her shrill accusations, I felt no guilt whatsoever. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion at how predictable she truly was. My father saw that my mother's tears were having absolutely zero effect on my posture. His face, already a mottled shade of red, rapidly darkened to a dangerous, furious purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his stiff collar. He slammed his fist down onto the table, rattling the crystal water glasses and causing the remaining champagne to slosh over the sides of the expensive flutes. You listen to me right now, Julia Richard roared, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of upper-class decorum. His voice boomed across the quiet restaurant, raw and hateful. If you walk away from this table, if you follow through with this insane threat, you are completely dead to me. Do you hear me now? You are no longer my daughter anymore. You will never be welcome in our home ever again. I will strip your name from every single family trust. I will cut you out of every legacy document. And I will make sure every single person in our social circle knows exactly what a deceitful, ungrateful snake you truly are. You will be entirely cut off. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a desperate need to see me cower, to see the old compliant Julia shrink back and apologize. He was playing his absolute final card, the ultimate threat of total familial banishment. He fully expected me to shatter. Instead, I simply looked at him and let out a soft, genuine sigh. You cannot kick me out of a home I have not felt welcome in for 15 years, Dad, I replied, my voice carrying a quiet, unshakable weight. And as for your legacy, I think we have already firmly established that I do not need a single penny of your money. I built my own legacy while you were busy trying to figure out how to leverage yours to save a failing manufacturing plant. The volume of my father's screaming and the escalating pitch of my mother's theatrical sobbing had officially crossed the line from a tense private dispute to a highly visible public disturbance. Diners at the adjacent tables were openly staring. Their conversations completely halted as they watched the implosion of the supposedly elite family sitting in the corner alcove. I had achieved everything I set out to accomplish tonight, and I had absolutely no desire to let their pathetic tantrums ruin the dining experience for my actual paying customers. I lifted my chin and caught the eye of David, my head of security, who had been standing at a discreet distance near the host stand ever since the yelling began. He was a tall, incredibly broad-shouldered man who ran my security teams with absolute military precision. He had been watching the alcove closely, waiting for my signal. I gave him a single, barely subtle nod. He immediately crossed the dining room, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, followed closely by two equally imposing members of his security staff. They moved with a smooth, coordinated efficiency that immediately commanded authority. David stepped up to the edge of the alcove, positioning his large frame between me and my father. These guests are becoming disruptive to the dining experience, I instructed clearly. Please escort them out. My parents froze, their mouths dropping open in synchronized, absolute shock at my command. The reality of the situation crashed down on them with brutal force. They were not just being asked to leave a public place. They were being actively thrown out of one of the finest restaurants in the city, an establishment owned by the daughter they had just tried to disown. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the two security guards stepped forward, their physical presence leaving absolutely no room for argument. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to muster one last display of patriarchal authority, but David simply stared him down, his expression completely blank and unyielding. Sir, I need you to stand up and walk toward the exit right now. David instructed, his tone indicating that a physical removal was the immediate next step if they refused to comply. Richard swallowed hard, all the bluster draining out of him as he realized he was entirely powerless. He grabbed his suit jacket from the back of his chair, his movements stiff and jerky. Patricia scrambled to her feet, hastily clutching her designer handbag against her chest as if she needed it for protection. Vanessa was already standing, her face a mask of pure humiliated terror as she realized the entire restaurant was watching them. But Gregory was simply not moving. He was staring down at the black leather folder sitting on the marble table, his broad chest heaving with cold panic. The $4,500 bill demanded immediate attention. He reached into his jacket pocket with hands that were trembling so violently he could barely even grasp his wallet. He pulled out a sleek corporate credit card, the plastic slipping from his sweaty fingers and clattering onto the table. He snatched it up hastily, his pale face slick with a heavy sheen of perspiration. He handed the card to the waiter, who had remained standing patiently nearby with a wireless payment terminal. Please, Gregory muttered, his voice barely an audible squeak. "Just run it," he begged softly, closing his eyes. The entire restaurant watched in absolute dead silence as the waiter inserted the card into the machine. The long, tense seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. Gregory stood completely rigid, holding his breath, desperately praying with every fiber of his being that the card would not decline in front of Chicago's elite society. I did not stand there and gloat over their well-deserved public misery. I turned my back on them before they reached the exit, walking directly into my bustling, brightly lit kitchen to oversee the rest of the busy dinner service and focus entirely on my future. Before reaching the heavy oak doors, there was the agonizing stop at the front desk. Gregory stood rigid, his hand hovering near his wallet as the maitre d' swiped the corporate card. The machine beeped sharply. The screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. Gregory stared at the glowing letters, his stomach dropping. He insisted it was a simple bank error, begging the polite host to run it again. The machine beeped again. The result was identical. Gregory patted his pockets, frantically checking for a personal card he knew was already maxed out from Vanessa's shopping sprees. Vanessa pressed her face into her hands, letting out a humiliated sob, while nearby diners openly stared. The untouchable corporate executive was gone, replaced by a suddenly sweating, panicked man. Richard shoved past his son-in-law with a disgusted grunt. He pulled a heavy leather wallet from his tailored trousers and aggressively slapped his platinum card onto the marble counter. "Run this one," he growled, not looking at anyone. The host processed the payment smoothly, handing the receipt over for a signature. Richard scrawled his name with enough force to nearly tear the thick paper. He had just spent $4,500 on a celebratory dinner that had morphed into absolute destruction. He shoved the receipt into his pocket, his jaw set in pure fury. The four of them stepped out onto the sidewalk. The freezing Chicago wind hit them instantly, a brutal slap against their flushed faces. The cold pierced through their designer coats, matching the sudden reality of their new circumstances. There was no luxurious town car waiting. There was no respectful valet rushing to open their doors. They were just four disgraced people shivering on a busy street corner. The silence lasted only until the heavy restaurant doors clicked shut behind them. Then the group exploded. Vanessa turned on Gregory like a rabid animal. "How could you let this happen?" she screamed, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "You told me you had this handled. You told me the Vanguard acquisition was a guaranteed victory. You let my little sister outsmart you. Now you are getting fired. You have lost your job, your income, and our social standing. How are we supposed to pay the mortgage, Gregory? You are completely incompetent." Gregory flinched away from her. "I did not know she owned the holding company, Vanessa," he yelled back, his voice thick with panic and resentment. "She used blind corporate structures and non-disclosure agreements. Do not pretend you had any idea either. You spent the entire night mocking her restaurant while she was sitting on a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. You pushed her to do this. You practically begged her to humiliate us." Richard stepped between them, his face dark red with unbridled rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his oldest daughter. "Do not you dare blame this entirely on him," Vanessa, Richard roared. "You bankrupted that boutique. You came crawling to me 10 years ago begging me to liquidate my retirement funds to save you from public embarrassment. You hid your financial ruin from your own husband, and now Julia has exposed all of your filthy secrets. She is going to let Apex Commercial collapse, and my manufacturing company will go bankrupt right alongside them. You have destroyed this family tonight." Patricia let out a loud, theatrical wail, leaning heavily against a street lamp. She clutched her expensive fur collar tightly around her neck, tears streaming down her carefully preserved face. "My friends are going to find out about this," she sobbed, her voice carrying down the block. "The entire social circle is going to know that we were thrown out like common criminals. They are going to know Julia is a millionaire, and we are completely broke. I will never be able to show my face at a charity gala again. This is an absolute nightmare." The argument devolved into a chaotic, vicious shouting match, their voices echoing off the brick buildings. Pedestrians paused to stare at the wealthy family tearing each other apart in the freezing cold. They were completely unraveled. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was entirely different. I had walked back through the bustling kitchen, checking on the line cooks and ensuring the dinner service was flowing flawlessly. The energy in the kitchen was electric, the staff moving with practiced precision, unaware of the massive shift in power that had just occurred in the front dining room. I smiled at my sous chef, approved a beautifully plated dish, and stepped into the hushed, carpeted hallway. I walked quietly back toward the front of the restaurant. I slipped into the private administrative hallway and stood behind the tinted glass window of the VIP alcove. The heavy glass was completely soundproof, but it offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the street outside. One of my servers, a young man who had been working with me since the food truck days, approached silently. He held a silver tray, carrying a single elegant crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. I took the glass with a small nod of gratitude, taking a slow, appreciative sip. The bubbles were crisp and cold against my tongue, the flavor deeply satisfying. I stood in the quiet warmth of my beautiful restaurant holding my champagne and watched my family on the sidewalk below. I watched them pointing fingers, screaming and shivering in the bitter wind. I watched the empire of lies they had built over decades finally collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. For 35 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of their disapproval. I had internalized every cruel comment, dismissive sigh, and unfair comparison. I had spent my entire life believing I was fundamentally flawed because I could not conform to their shallow expectations. I had worked myself to the bone, not just to build a business, but to prove to myself that I had value. As I watched them argue on that freezing street corner, the final heavy chain of my childhood trauma simply snapped. I felt the thick iron links fall away from my chest, leaving behind an incredible sensation of profound lightness. The ghosts of the past no longer held any power over me. Their opinions, their judgments, and their conditional love were completely irrelevant. I had outgrown them in every conceivable way. I was no longer the quiet, discarded sister seeking their validation. I was a remarkably successful, fiercely independent woman who had built an empire entirely on her own terms. I took another slow sip of the vintage champagne, savoring the absolute peace that washed over me. I watched my father frantically trying to hail a passing taxi, while my mother continued to weep into her fur collar. I watched Gregory staring blankly down at the pavement, his career completely over, while Vanessa screamed into her cell phone, likely trying to call her country club friends to spin a desperate web of new lies. They were exactly where they deserved to be, left out in the cold to face the brutal consequences of their own actions. I turned away from the tinted glass, leaving them to their misery. The restaurant behind me was filled with the warm, joyous sounds of my guests laughing and celebrating. My real estate portfolio was secure and expanding. I had a brilliant, unburdened life waiting for me. The consequences of the night began to ripple out into their lives. The cold winter thawed into a damp, gray Chicago spring, and over the course of those 3 long months, the absolute devastation of my family unfolded exactly as Gregory had predicted on that marble floor. The senior partners at Apex Commercial did not accept apologies, and they certainly did not accept excuses. When the Monday morning deadline arrived and the Vanguard Holdings acquisition officially died, they acted with brutal corporate efficiency. Gregory was called into the top-floor boardroom before he even had a chance to log into his computer. They terminated his employment on the spot. They stripped him of his senior title, revoked his unvested stock options, and had security escort him from the glass high-rise with his belongings packed into a single cardboard box. The massive executive salary he had used to bankroll my sister vanished overnight. Without that substantial monthly infusion of cash, the delicate house of cards Vanessa had built immediately collapsed. Gregory, sitting at home in a state of shell-shocked unemployment, finally had the free time to look closely at their joint finances. What he discovered pushed their already fractured marriage past the point of no return. Vanessa had not just maxed out the primary premium cards he knew about. She had secretly opened 6 additional lines of credit under her own name, desperately shuffling balances to maintain her flawless country club aesthetic. She owed hundreds of thousands of dollars for designer clothes, custom jewelry, and pure vanity purchases. The screaming matches echoed through the empty halls of their massive suburban mansion, so loud and vicious that the wealthy neighbors actually called the police on 3 separate occasions to complain. With zero income and mounting collections, they could no longer afford the exorbitant mortgage payments. Within 6 weeks of the restaurant incident, a bright red foreclosure warning appeared on their pristine front door. They were forced to list the house for a fraction of its market value just to liquidate, quickly selling off Vanessa's beloved imported furniture and luxury cars to cover closing costs and appease creditors. They packed their remaining clothes and moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The luxurious lifestyle Vanessa had wielded as a weapon against me for her entire adult life evaporated, leaving her trapped in a tiny space with a furious unemployed husband. The fallout was not contained to my sister and her husband. Chicago high society is an incredibly small, viciously observant circle, and a public humiliation of that magnitude is completely impossible to sweep under the rug. Word of their spectacular ejection from my restaurant spread through the elite country club gossip mill like wildfire. The wealthy women, who had spent years listening to my mother brag about her golden children, had witnessed Patricia wailing on the freezing sidewalk, completely stripped of her dignity. The social judgment was swift, silent, and absolute. When Patricia walked into the club dining room for her usual Tuesday luncheon, her former friends suddenly averted their eyes and picked up their menus. Conversations stopped dead as she approached the tables. Her regular tennis partners began making polite, flimsy excuses to cancel their matches, and she was quietly dropped from the prestigious charity committees she had dedicated her life to climbing. She was effectively exiled from the only world she cared about, left to sit alone in her silent house, frantically checking her phone for invitations that were never going to arrive. My father suffered a much heavier, far more destructive blow. Richard had spent decades carefully cultivating an image of unshakable financial stability. He relied on that pristine reputation to secure the rolling credit lines that kept his manufacturing company afloat through tough economic seasons. But the business world is heavily reliant on perception, confidence, and association. When Gregory went down in flames at Apex Commercial, toxic rumors began to swirl about Richard. Investors started looking much closer at his manufacturing firm, noticing the sluggish profit margins and the outdated production models he had stubbornly refused to modernize. They saw an aging man whose son-in-law was a disgraced corporate failure and whose own daughter had publicly humiliated him in front of the city's financial elite. The banks grew incredibly wary of his stability. When Richard applied to renew his essential corporate loans in early April, the underwriters balked. They cited his close financial association with Gregory and the sudden glaring instability within his family structure. They flatly denied the loan extension and demanded immediate payment on his outstanding balances. Richard's business, the core of his identity and his primary source of arrogance, began to slowly hemorrhage cash. The facade of the perfect superior family was entirely destroyed. They were no longer the wealthy, untouchable elite who could sit in expensive restaurants and openly mock my culinary ambitions. They were drowning in massive debt, socially isolated from their peers, and facing total, irreversible financial ruin. The harsh reality of their situation settled over them like a thick, suffocating blanket. They had spent their entire lives relying heavily on the pristine illusion of success, and now that the grand illusion was gone, they had absolutely nothing left to fall back on. Richard could not simply bully his creditors into submission. Patricia could not cry her way back into the exclusive country club. Vanessa could not shop her way out of a cramped apartment, and Gregory could not bluff his way into another executive position with a thoroughly ruined professional reputation. Late one Tuesday evening, they gathered in the small living room of Vanessa and Gregory's new apartment. The tight space was cluttered with unopened cardboard boxes, a stark, depressing contrast to the sprawling, immaculate estates they were accustomed to. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with unsaid resentments, and the crushing weight of their collective failure. Richard sat heavily on a cheap second-hand sofa, staring at the floor with bloodshot eyes, his manufacturing firm just days away from missing payroll for the first time in company history. Patricia sat rigidly beside him, her hands trembling as she clutched a paper napkin, her expensive manicures a thing of the past. Vanessa was pacing the worn carpet, her face pale and exhausted, while Gregory stood by the single window staring out at the noisy traffic below. They had run out of wealthy friends to borrow from. They had run out of assets to leverage. They had exhausted every single available option. The grim silence in the room was finally broken by my father. He slowly raised his head, looking around at the broken pieces of his proud family. He swallowed hard, the bitter taste of absolute defeat visible on his aging face. He knew what he had to do, and he knew exactly how much it was going to cost his pride. The angry promise he had screamed at me outside the restaurant, the vicious vow that I was dead to him and would never be spoken to again, hung thickly in the cramped air. He had sworn to completely cut me out of their lives, but desperation has a way of violently overriding pride. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hand shaking slightly as he unlocked the bright screen. He scrolled past the country club acquaintances and the business partners who were no longer returning his calls. He stopped scrolling when he finally reached my name. Desperation forces the family to break their promise of never speaking to Julia again. The following Monday morning, my office felt unusually quiet. Sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking the same city block Gregory had threatened to take from me. Down below, delivery trucks backed into narrow alleys. Cooks carried crates of produce through side entrances, and the lunch crowd was already beginning to form outside the bakeries and cafes that made the street feel alive. It was the kind of ordinary morning I had fought years to protect. My phone lit up beside my coffee. At first it was Vanessa, then Patricia, then Richard, then Vanessa again. The calls came in clusters, one after another, desperate and relentless. I watched the screen flash with their names and felt nothing close to panic. 10 years ago, those names would have twisted my stomach into knots. One missed call from my mother could ruin an entire day. One angry voicemail from my father could send me spiraling into guilt. One message from Vanessa could pull me right back into the role she had assigned me since childhood. But that morning, the phone was just an object on my desk. By 9:30, the first voicemail arrived from Gregory. His voice sounded nothing like the polished corporate executive who had stood over me in my restaurant. It was horse-shaken and stripped of every ounce of arrogance. "Julia, listen. I need you to call Apex. Just tell them there was a misunderstanding. Tell them you are open to renegotiating. You do not understand what this will do to me." I deleted it. A second voicemail came from Vanessa less than 10 minutes later. She was crying so hard that her words barely held together. "Julia, please. You made your point. Gregory is in serious trouble. We could lose the house. Do you understand that? We could lose everything. I know we have had problems, but you are my sister. You cannot just let this happen to me." I stared out the window at the restaurant awnings fluttering in the morning wind. She still did not understand. I was not letting anything happen to her. I was simply refusing to stop the consequences she had earned. My father's message came next. His tone was stern at first, as though he still believed authority could be summoned by force of habit. "Julia, this has gone far enough. Family does not destroy family. You need to call me immediately so we can discuss how to fix the damage you have caused." There was a pause. Then his voice lowered. "Your mother has not slept. Vanessa is hysterical. Gregory may lose his position. I know things were said at dinner, but you need to think carefully about whether you want to be responsible for tearing this family apart." That one almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Richard. Even after the truth came out, even after he had been exposed as the man who framed his own daughter to protect his favorite child, he still found a way to make the damage my responsibility. Patricia's voicemail was the last one I listened to. She did not yell. She did not command. She sounded tired, almost fragile, and somehow that made the manipulation even clearer. Julia, sweetheart, I know you are angry, but mothers make mistakes, fathers make mistakes, sisters make mistakes. You cannot hold on to bitterness forever. Come home for dinner this week. We can talk privately. No lawyers, no documents, no restaurant staff watching us. Just family. I played that message twice. Then I saved it. Not because I wanted to hear her voice again, but because I wanted a reminder of how easily they could dress control up as love. No apology, no accountability, no recognition of what they had done. Just an invitation to come home, sit at their table, and quietly become useful again. I opened my contacts. One by one, I blocked their numbers. Vanessa, Gregory, Patricia, Richard. There was no dramatic music, no thunder outside the window, no final speech delivered to an audience. Just 4 names disappearing from my screen one after another, until the room became peaceful again. A soft knock sounded at my office door. Chef David stepped inside, holding the revised menu for the winter launch. "The investors are arriving at 11, he said, and the new tenant from the corner property confirmed the lease signing for tomorrow. I took the folder from him and smiled. "Good," I said. "Let's keep building." That evening, I stood on the rooftop terrace above the Obsidian Room and watched the city lights blink awake across Chicago. Below me, my restaurant glowed warmly through the windows, full of laughter, clinking glasses, and people who had come to celebrate something real. For the first time in years, my success did not feel like something I needed to hide. My family had spent a decade calling me a failure because that story made them comfortable. But their comfort was never my truth. And from that night forward, I stopped paying for a seat at tables where I had never truly been welcome. I started building my own. The screen of my cell phone lit up against the dark mahogany of my desk, vibrating softly as the incoming call illuminated the quiet sanctuary of my office. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 4 days after Richard had realized his manufacturing firm was going to default on its payroll obligations. I let the phone ring, watching the screen until the call rolled over to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification icon appeared. I pressed play and placed the phone on my desk, leaning back in my leather chair. Richard did not start with an apology. He started with the exact same entitlement he had wielded my entire life. "Julia, you need to pick up the phone right now." His voice boomed through the speaker, sharp and demanding. He sounded out of breath, as if he had been pacing the floor in a panic. "This silent treatment is incredibly immature, and it has gone on long enough. You made your point at the restaurant, but now real businesses are suffering. I need a massive cash injection by Friday to keep the assembly lines running. We can structure it as a loan against Vanguard Holdings. You owe it to the family name to fix this. Call me back the second you get this message." I listened to the sharp click as he hung up. There was no warmth, no regret, and absolutely no recognition of the damage he had caused. He still viewed me entirely as a resource to be managed. I deleted the message with a single swipe of my finger, feeling my pulse remain perfectly steady. I did not ever call him back. The weeks went by, and the seasons began to change. Spring gave way to the humid heat of a Chicago summer. My phone remained a one-way channel for their escalating panic. As Richard's demands went unanswered, the strategy shifted. The next wave of voicemails came from my mother. Patricia was a woman who had spent her entire life negotiating social contracts, and she approached my silence like a broken treaty she could easily mend with a few empty words. I was reviewing the quarterly profit margins for Vanguard Holdings when her voice filled my office. "Julia, darling, it is your mother." She began, her tone dripping with an artificial syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We really need to put all this ugliness behind us. The country club gala is next month, and people are starting to ask uncomfortable questions. I told them you were just busy with your restaurant projects, but we simply must present a united front. If you just cover your father's outstanding debts, I will guarantee that you get a seat at our table for the holidays. We can even bring some of your food to the charity luncheon." She was trying to bargain with me, offering the same conditional scraps of approval I had spent 3 decades starving for. She honestly believed that the promise of a seat at her table would be enough to make me surrender my empire. I listened to her shallow promises, waiting for a familiar sting of rejection, but it never came. Her words held absolutely no power over me anymore. I let the message reach its end, deleted it, and went right back to quietly reviewing my financial projections. By the time late August arrived, the tone of the voicemails had descended into desperation. The bank had officially taken possession of the suburban mansion, and Gregory was still completely unemployable. They had nothing left to leverage. That was when Vanessa finally decided to break her silence. She called me on a Friday evening, right in the middle of our busiest dinner rush. I stepped away from the chaotic energy of the kitchen and slipped into my quiet office to listen to her message. Vanessa did not yell, and she did not accuse me of ruining her life like she had on the freezing sidewalk months ago. Instead, she sounded completely broken. "Julia, please pick up," she sobbed, her voice trembling and pathetic. "Gregory and I are drowning. We cannot afford the rent on this apartment for another month, and my credit cards are completely maxed out. I do not even have enough money to buy groceries this week. I know we said some harsh things, but we are sisters. We share the same blood. We really need a family reconciliation. Please, Julia, you have so much money now. You can easily afford to help us get back on our feet. I am begging you to remember that we are a family." I stared at the phone, quietly analyzing the transparent veiled plea for a financial bailout. She did not want a sister. She never had. She just wanted a human ATM to fund her vanity and rescue her from the miserable reality of her own terrible choices. I sat in the dim light of my office and let the silence of the room wash over me. I looked at the digital display on my phone, staring at the long list of missed calls and voicemails from the 3 people who had caused me so much pain. For my entire life, I had believed that I needed their validation to prove my worth. I had desperately chased their approval, hoping that if I just proved I was not a failure, they would finally love me the way they loved each other. But sitting there listening to them beg for my money while ignoring my humanity, I realized the absolute truth. I had never needed their validation. They were deeply flawed, selfish people who were incapable of experiencing genuine love. They valued wealth status and appearance above all else. I picked up my phone and opened the contact list. I selected my father's number and pressed the block button. I did the exact same thing for my mother, and then finally for Vanessa. With 3 simple taps of my finger, I permanently severed their access to my life. I dropped the phone onto my desk and leaned back, exhaling a long, deep breath. The suffocating anxiety I had carried in my chest since childhood evaporated. I was now free. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my jacket, and stepped out of my office to review a new milestone for my empire. I walked past the bustling dining room and took the elevator up to the top floor. Pushing open the glass doors, I stepped out onto the private rooftop terrace of my building. I walked slowly to the edge, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city that had once felt large and cold now felt like a kingdom I had conquered on my own terms. The terrace door opened behind me. Chef David brought up a white plate featuring a brand new seasonal dish for me to taste. I took a careful bite, letting the flavors wash over my palate, and smiled warmly at him. I grabbed a pen, confidently signing off on the new menu. As he quietly retreated back inside, I stayed at the railing. I reflected on the incredible fact that I had built a multi-million-dollar empire from the very scraps my family had thrown at me. I stood there bathed in the night air, looking out at the endless sea of city lights. I finally knew that the ultimate sweet revenge was not just destroying their lies. It was building a beautiful, undeniable truth of my own. The journey of overcoming familial betrayal and financial manipulation offers a profound lesson on self-worth, absolute independence, and the true definition of family. Throughout this narrative, the protagonist endured the suffocating weight of being the designated scapegoat, constantly overshadowed by a favored sibling and diminished by parents who valued superficial status over genuine connection. Yet instead of allowing their conditional love and constant belittlement to break her spirit, she channeled that deep pain into building an undeniable, self-sustaining empire. The core lesson here is that your inherent value is never determined by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. When the individuals who are supposed to protect and nurture you, instead, view you merely as a convenient resource or a repository for their own insecurities, the healthiest response is often stepping away entirely. You do not need the approval of toxic individuals, even if they share your bloodline. True confidence is built by recognizing your own capabilities in the dark and trusting your vision when no one else will. Furthermore, success serves as the ultimate boundary. There was no need for explosive vengeance or petty retaliation. Quietly securing independence and rendering their insults and eventual desperate demands powerless is the most effective form of justice. Blood might connect people biologically, but loyalty, unwavering respect, and mutual support are what actually construct a family. The protagonist found her true family among the dedicated, hardworking team she built around her from the ground up. Ultimately, the sweetest revenge is not found in destroying those who hurt you, but in constructing a beautiful, undeniable reality of your own. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic expectations to build your own success? Share your journey in the comments below. If this story of reclaiming your power and defining your own worth resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph.